Hello everyone and welcome back to this video. We're working on the Dorman 2LB today. It's been a while since we've worked on this one while we've been waiting for parts to turn up. We now have all the parts that are required to rebuild this back to a long motor. So as you can see here, the block has all been cleaned up. So first job is to get it upside down and start putting the crankshaft back in. Okay, so this crank was actually in really good condition, so it's only had a light polish. So the shells that have gone in are standard shells. We've already checked clearances and bits and pieces, so it's all fine to bolt back together again. So upper portions of the thrust washers are in, and the lower shells. So we'll now get the main bearing caps back in and get it torqued down. So that's the crank in and torqued. So we'll do a quick check of the end float before we knock over the lock tabs, and then we'll be able to move on. Next job is to put the camshaft in. So we now have the DTI set up to check end float. The crank is currently pushed fully that way, so we'll pull it the other way and see what we see. So we now need to time the cam to the crankshaft. This is a little bit of a fun task because you can see here, I've just marked them with a bit of blue pen, the timing marks on the cam gear. Now, that's all good, except on the crank gear, this goes on this way round, and the timing mark is here. So what I've done is I've coloured in the top of the tooth and put a mark on it so that I can see which is the correct tooth that we align between the two marks here. So we'll do that now, and you have to warm this slightly to get it over the end of the crank as well. There we go. So that's it over the crank, and the gears matched up on the between the crank and the camshaft. Now these three dowels are slightly offset, so you can't get it on in the wrong orientation. So anyway, with that now back on, our next job will be to refit the bell housing, which goes over this end here, and that will allow us to stand the engine up on its end. Flywheel end, so it'll be stood on this end, and we can put the con rods in and the pistons, get the front cover on, do all the oil pipe work within the sump, and get the sump refitted. So that's just loosely nipped up for now. We'll give that 10 minutes for the sealant to cure a bit, and then tighten it up the rest of the way. So with the bell housing all now fully fitted and the engine stood up on end, before we fit all the main bearing oil pipe work that goes here, we're going to fit the pistons and connecting rods, because it just makes it a lot easier because the pipe work's out the way. So first job for that is to check the new piston ring end gaps in the bores. So we'll get on and check those, and we'll get the pistons and connecting rods fitted back in. So now we have both pistons and con rods all in, and they are just hand nipped up. We just want to quickly check that the thing still turns, which it does. I can do that by hand. So what we'll do now is we'll torque up the big ends. Again, check that it turns before knocking all the lock tabs over, and then the next job will be starting to put all the main bearing pipe work on. That's number one torqued up. It still turns with number one torqued up. There we go. So just check that that still turns, and then we can get the lock tabs knocked over. Try not to squash my hands. Yeah, so that all turns. So we'll get the lock tabs knocked over and then start on the main bearing pipework. So there we go with all the oil pipe work fitted up. On these engines, the oil is picked up from the sump here, comes round and into the pump. It comes out of the pump and then round, exits the engine where it goes into an external oil filter housing. It then returns via this hole here and feeds the main bearing. So although this looks like it's connected to the oil pump, this is actually a separate drilling that comes into the oil pump housing and down into the main bearing. Next up is to get the end cover on here. Now, first thing we need to do is fit a new lip seal for where it sits around the crank here. Now we have a genuine one here, so we'll get that fitted and put the cover on. And there's no bolts that go in this one here and there because that's where dowels sit. Okay, so with the sump now on, the next job we've got to do, and the last job with the engine in this orientation, is to put the tappet chest on for the camshaft, which goes in here. The reason being is the tappets are just a cylinder with a hole in the middle of them, and if you try and do it with the engine stood up, it's very difficult to get the tappets to stay in place as they like to fall out the bottom. So with it this way, they stay in place just a lot easier. So we're going to fit that in and then stand the engine up the correct way. Engine's now back up the right way. We're now going to get the cylinder head studs back in, head gasket in place, and then put the cylinder head on. Okay, so that's all the head studs in. Now the head gaskets on these are a multi-layered steel head gasket, so we'll get that in place. We've got a new one. Get the cylinder head sorted out and get the cylinder head bolted on. There we go. That's the new head gasket in place. So next job, we'll just make sure that the face on the cylinder head's all clean and get the cylinder head on. Okay, so these two extended nuts offer a lifting eye that bolts on top of them. So the next thing we need to do before we can tighten this down is install the push rods and the rockers, because there's a decompressor shaft here that is held down by this cylinder head stud. So we'll get that all in place, and then we can torque the head down. There we go. So that's all the rockers in. Obviously they'll need adjusting for clearances, but we'll do that once the flywheel is back on and the engine's a bit easier to turn over. So with that now in place, we can put the decompressor shaft in, which will allow us to put this last nut on, and then we can torque everything down. Okay, so with that now in place, we can get on and torque the cylinder head down, so we'll do that next. Okay, so that's everything just nipped down, so now we'll get on to torquing it up. So there we go. So we've got a lifting eye to bolt on here, and water outlet casting to go on this side, oil pressure relief valve unit, and then once we've done that we can take the engine up ready for paint. So first up on the list to refit the engine so we're ready for paint is this, which is the oil pressure relief valve housing. Now we need to make a gasket up for this. Normally, obviously, most people just buy the gaskets, but these are not available anymore. So we need to make one. Now, there's a number of different ways of making a gasket, depending on what tools you have available. At the absolute minimum, you can do it with a small ball peen hammer, or I could get a biro out, draw around it all, and then cut it out with a pair of scissors. Or use wad punches to punch out all the holes in the gaskets. So we're not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but you'll see me use a couple of different methods as we make the gaskets to put a few bits back onto the engine. But we'll get that done, and then it's get the tape and the paper out to take the engine up for paint. So first up, we're going to make this gasket, and the method I'm going to use on this one is just a ball peen hammer. I don't think you need much more in the way of tools but for this one, so hold it still and in place. I'm just going to use the original casting to mark out the holes. Now, it's obviously very important that you don't allow it to move. There you go, that's the mounting holes. So now we'll do the ports for the actual gasket itself. I just did what I said, don't let it move. Right, now with all the holes in it, you can now trace around the edge. A few sticky bits still. So here we go with the gasket we've just made. So for the eagle-eyed of you, you'll spot there's only 3 bolts. That because idiot here left one of them with the dash panel we took off, which is currently in a box 30 miles away from where we are now. So we'll go and get that, and that will get put on at a later date. Okay, well with that all bolted up, we'll move on to the castings on the side of the cylinder head. So for the next few gaskets, we're going to take a slightly different route. These are the gaskets for these components here. But the way I've done these is place the item on top of the gasket paper. I've cut round them with a scalpel, which has given me the external shape, and then marked down through the holes for where all the bolt holes are going to be. And we're going to use this, which is a wad punch, to punch out all the holes. So as I say, more than one way to make new gaskets. And there you go, punched out gasket. Okay, so we now have the engine built as far as it needs to be for paint. So we're going to get on with taping everything up that obviously we don't want covered in paint, and then get it outside and hopefully get it in some colour. So after exhausting several rolls of tape, we're now ready for paint. So we'll get ready and do that, but we are trying a new paint today, so although it's the same colour as the 6LXB we've not long done, It's a single coat paint, so we don't need to prime it beforehand as long as the substrate is steel based, iron based. Aluminium we'd still have to prime, so we're going to give that a go. So I'm going to mix up some paint and then we'll get started. Anyway, with that now all painted, that's as much as we've got time for in this video. So I hope you've enjoyed watching this go back together to this point. In the next video we'll carry on with getting all the ancillary components bolted back on. If you've enjoyed watching this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you for watching and see you next time.